The air inside the restaurant was thick with tension. It was a place where power walked with every step, and the walls seemed to whisper the weight of deals made and lives destroyed. Tonight, however, it was heavier than ever. The kind of tension that clung to the skin made the breath feel shallow and the heart beat louder than usual. Juno Park, known as the Dragon, sat at his usual table, the one where he had the perfect view of both the entrance and the kitchen door.
He was no ordinary man.
His presence demanded attention, respect, and fear. He was the Mafia boss, the ruler of this empire that stretched beyond the walls of this luxurious restaurant. The guests around him, politicians, celebrities, and businessmen worth billions, ate in silence, eyes flickering to his table but daring not to make eye contact. Tonight was different. Tonight his father was coming. Chairman Minsuk Park, the old emperor from the east, was a legend. A man so feared that even his own son, the dragon himself, would never dare to stand in his shadow. He had not set foot on American soil in 2 decades. The power he wielded was ancient, brutal, built on blood and loyalty. And tonight, he was coming to inspect his son's empire. Juno's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the entrance, as if willing the moment to hurry. There was something in the air that made even him feel small, something only a man like his father could summon. Every few minutes, he would glance at his watch, checking the time, and every time, it seemed like the seconds stretched on forever. In the kitchen, the staff moved in synchronized silence. The clattering of knives, the rustle of aprons, the soft murmur of orders being given. Everything seemed to be in slow motion, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Even Robert, the manager, seemed pale, his face a mask of anxiety. It was as if they all knew that nothing would ever be the same once the chairman arrived. And then, as if the world itself had decided to stop spinning for just a moment, the heavy doors to the restaurant swung open. A cold gust of wind cut through the room, making every head turn. 2 black sedans slid to the curb outside, their tires hissing against the slick pavement. The doors opened, and a man stepped out. He was shorter than his son but seemed to take up more space, as if the very air bent to his will. Minsuk Park, the chairman, had arrived. The room fell silent. Every voice, every clink of silverware, every breath seemed to disappear. All eyes were on him, but none dared to meet his gaze. His face was a map of hardship, each wrinkle telling a story of pain, power, and regret. His eyes were dark, absorbing the light around him, cold as the ocean depths. He walked slowly, deliberately, his gnarled cane tapping against the floor with every step, a constant reminder of his power, his age, and the indomitable force of his will. Juno stood to greet him, his posture perfect, his hands clenched by his sides. He was the son of this man, the one who had built this empire, but in this moment, he was just a child before a king. He offered a bow, a sign of respect that he had learned to give even in his adult years. The chairman barely acknowledged him, giving him only a curt nod as he passed. He didn't look at the restaurant, didn't admire the art or the opulence. He walked past the grand chandeliers, the paintings worth millions, as if they were nothing but cheap trinkets. He sniffed the air, as if tasting the legitimacy of the place, the smell of money and power. Juno, standing at the entrance, felt a pang of discomfort. His father's disapproval weighed heavily on him. And then, as the chairman took his seat at the head of the table, Juno noticed her.
Nia.
She was invisible to most. A ghost in the background. The shy waitress who had served here for the last year, moving quietly between tables, her face barely acknowledged by anyone. But to Juno, she had always been something of a curiosity. A beautiful woman, hidden beneath the unassuming white dress and red vest. She never spoke unless she had to, never drew attention to herself. And that, in a world like this, was a skill unto itself. Nia's heart hammered in her chest. Tonight, something was different. She could feel it in the air, The way the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The way the kitchen had fallen eerily silent, save for the sharp clack of knives against cutting boards. She knew who had arrived. Min Suk Park. The dragon's father. The man who ruled with an iron fist. She had heard whispers of him, stories about his brutality, his sharp eyes that could cut through a person in a single glance. The manager, Robert, suddenly appeared at her side, his face pale with fear. "You," he snapped, his voice harsh. "Private dining room. Table 7. Go." Nia's stomach dropped. Table 7. The private room. That room was reserved for the most important guests, the ones who held the most power. The ones who made and broke fortunes. It was a room where deals were made, deals that could cost lives. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Now," Robert hissed, shoving a tray into her hands. The tray trembled in her hands, but she steadied herself, making her way to the private room with slow, deliberate steps. The door was heavy, the wood smooth beneath her fingertips as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the heavy scent of cigars hanging in the air like a fog. The chairman sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his son and the lieutenants who had helped build this empire. Sang-woo, the snake-like advisor with a smile that never seemed to falter, and D-Sik, a mountain of a man who looked like he could crush a car with his bare hands. Nia moved silently, her eyes locked on the tray she carried. She poured the water for the chairman first, her hand steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. Then she moved to pour for Juno, her steps slow, measured. And that's when it happened. The chairman's voice, deep and gravelly, rumbled through the thick smoke-filled room. He spoke, but it wasn't in English. It wasn't even standard Korean. It was a dialect so old, so deeply rooted in history, that even Juno had trouble understanding it. Nia's breath caught in her throat. The dialect. The language of her grandmother. The language she hadn't heard in years. The one she had been taught in secret. The one that had been passed down through the generations in whispers. The language of the southern coast, a place that had been swallowed by time and history. Nia's hand froze, the water halfway between the pitcher and the glass. The room seemed to tilt, the world falling away. The chairman's eyes flicked to her, narrowing. "Wine," he demanded, his voice a low rumble, the power of his command unmistakable. And in that moment, everything shifted. Nia didn't know what came over her, but she couldn't help herself. The words were out before she could stop them. She responded in that ancient dialect, her voice steady, a perfect mirror of the chairman's own. "Good evening, Chairman Park." The room fell silent. Every eye in the room turned to her. Juno's face went pale. Sang-woo's smile vanished, replaced by shock. D6's hand twitched, as if reaching for the weapon beneath his jacket. The chairman didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Nia's, cold and calculating. The moment stretched out for what felt like an eternity, the silence thick and suffocating. And then, without a word, he nodded. The rest of the room remained frozen. It wasn't just that Nia spoke the dialect. It was how she spoke it. It wasn't clumsy or hesitant, like someone who had learned it in passing. She spoke it with the weight of history behind her words, with the respect that the chairman demanded. It was a language of blood, of loyalty, of secrets. And she had just used it to greet the most feared man in the room, a man who had never once acknowledged her existence. The power in that moment was unmistakable. And then, as quickly as the silence had fallen, it shattered. Juno's voice cut through the tension. "Nia, get out," he snapped, his words laced with both confusion and anger. But Nia didn't move. She stood tall, her eyes never leaving the chairman's. The chairman's eyes, once dull with disdain, now sparked with something more dangerous. "You," he said, his voice softer now but no less threatening. "Where do you come from?" And in that moment, Nia realized that this wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just a waitress caught in a moment of recklessness. No, she had just triggered something much, much bigger than herself.
A debt.
A blood debt. But whose blood? And just like that, the stage was set for a game far bigger than she could have ever imagined. The moments after Nia's words hung in the air, there was a shift in the atmosphere, subtle at first, like the quiet before a storm. Every guest in the room, every powerful individual who had been too afraid to even breathe in the presence of Chairman Minsuk Park, now looked at Nia as if they had seen something that shouldn't exist. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an enigma, a ghost that had come alive and shaken the very foundations of this empire. Nia's heart hammered in her chest, her palms clammy against the cold silver tray she held. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected her grandmother's language to surface so suddenly, so powerfully. But there she was, standing in the lion's den, the ancient dialect of her people coming out effortlessly, as though it had always been a part of her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized the danger she had just walked into. This wasn't a casual mistake. This wasn't a simple, forgotten word from childhood. No, this was something else entirely. Chairman Park had heard it, understood it. And now, the weight of his stare was enough to break her resolve. He was studying her, his dark eyes tracing every inch of her, searching for something, some sign, some piece of her past that might explain why this young waitress had just spoken his language, the language of a bygone era, the language of his roots. He had been testing her, but in that brief exchange, she had passed the test. And now, she was more than just a waitress. The chairman's lip curled ever so slightly as he leaned back in his chair, his cane tapping against the marble floor, a sound that echoed in the room like the ticking of a clock. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on everyone. Juno Park, the dragon, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his gaze locked on Nia. He was the Mafia boss, the one who controlled everything in the city. But now, for the first time, he seemed like a child again, caught off guard by something far beyond his control. His father, the chairman, was silent, his eyes never leaving Nia, as if he had found something in her that he couldn't yet comprehend. Nia stood her ground, her spine straight, her face a mask of calm, though inside, she felt anything but. She knew the danger she had just invited. She could see it in the way the men around the table stiffened, in the way their eyes darted nervously from one to another. They were all wondering the same thing. Who is she? The chairman's voice finally broke the silence. His words were low, measured, but there was an edge to them, a sharpness that made the room feel even colder. You speak our tongue well, he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her with a look that made Nia's blood run cold. Better than most of my own men. Nia swallowed, her throat dry. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, the weight of it was heavier than she had imagined. She had no choice but to answer, no choice but to stand in the storm that was quickly building around her. I learned it from my grandmother, she said softly, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. She was from the southern coast. The chairman's gaze flickered, the briefest hint of recognition flashing across his face. He leaned forward slightly, his cane tapping against the floor in a rhythmic pattern. The southern coast, he repeated. A place of old blood. A place of power. Nia nodded, her chest tightening with each word. She could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. The chairman wasn't just curious about her, he was probing, searching for something. What, exactly, she didn't know yet. But she couldn't afford to reveal too much. The southern coast, the chairman's voice trailed off, as though lost in thought. A place of ancient traditions, of families that ruled with honor. And yet he looked up at her again, his eyes cold as ice. Your family, they disappeared, vanished into the winds of time. Why are you here, little one? Why did you come to me? Nia's breath caught in her throat. She had been waiting for this question, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to answer. How much should she reveal? How much of her past should she risk showing? The blood debt her family owed, and the debt that they had been forced to carry, had been buried deep in the past, far away from this world of power and violence. But now, it seemed, that past was threatening to rise again. Her mind raced. She could tell the truth, or at least part of it, but she would have to be careful. A single misstep, a single slip of the tongue, and everything could be lost.
I
I came to America with nothing, she said, her voice quiet but firm. My grandmother came here after the war. She wanted to leave her past behind, to start over. The chairman didn't speak, but his eyes never left hers. He was listening, studying, and in that silence, Nia could feel the weight of centuries of history pressing down on her. Your family was once powerful, he said, his tone colder now, more deliberate. But it was lost, wiped out. Nia felt her heart skip a beat. The chairman's words were like knives, each one cutting deeper into the truth she had buried for so long. The blood her family had spilled, the honor that had been stolen, and the vengeance that had been waiting patiently for the right moment. It was all coming to the surface. She swallowed hard, trying to push the fear down. My grandmother said we were cursed, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That the blood of our family would always be hunted, that we would never find peace. The room was still again, the silence thick with the weight of her words. Juno didn't say anything, but Nia could feel his eyes on her, burning with questions, burning with suspicion. The tension in the room was unbearable. And then, just when Nia thought the moment couldn't get any worse, the chairman spoke again. You are a ghost then, he said, his voice a mixture of cold amusement and something else, something darker. A ghost from a family that should have been forgotten. But you are here, in my house, in my empire. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like the walls might collapse under its weight. Tell me, little ghost, the chairman continued, his voice low and dangerous. What do you want from me? Revenge? Redemption? Nia's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The moment she had been dreading, the moment when the past and present would collide. She could feel the weight of her grandmother's words pressing down on her, that she would never find peace. But could she find something else? Something more than revenge? Could she take back what was lost, even if it meant everything? I came for what's mine, Nia said, her voice steady, the words coming out more forcefully than she expected. I came for my family's honor. The chairman studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then finally he spoke. We'll see about that. And in that moment, everything changed. The room seemed to close in around Nia, the walls pushing in on her. The very air felt heavy, suffocating. She was standing on the edge of something much larger than herself, a game that had been played for generations, a battle between two families that had been lost to time. But now, with a single sentence, the chairman had just thrown her into the heart of it. Her fate, and the fate of everyone in that room, would be decided in the coming days. The night dragged on, but Nia felt like time had stopped. Every second, every breath seemed stretched, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, some catastrophic moment that would rip through the thick tension in the air. The silence in the private room had become unbearable, a chasm that deepened with every passing minute. The chairman, still seated at the head of the table, did not speak again, his piercing eyes still locked onto Nia, studying her as if she were a rare insect trapped under a microscope. Juno, the dragon, stood to one side, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. His father had said nothing since Nia had spoken, but she could feel the storm inside him building. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but they flickered constantly, shifting between Nia and his father. It was as though he were trapped between two worlds, the one his father had built, a world of power and respect, and the one he had forged for himself, where loyalty was as fragile as a thread. Nia stood there, her hands trembling behind her back, still holding the silver tray, a symbol of her role in this world of wealth and violence. She was still the shy waitress, invisible to most, but not tonight. Tonight, she had spoken the language of kings, and she had caught the attention of the one man in this room who could crush her with a single word. The one man who, for reasons she could barely comprehend, seemed both disgusted and fascinated by her. She had known the stakes were high, when she had come to this country, when she had taken the job in the palace that concealed itself as a restaurant. But she hadn't known just how high until now. Her past, her bloodline, was now a weapon that had been pulled out of hiding, exposed to the very men who had wiped her family off the map. And she had no idea how to play this game. The chairman's gaze never wavered from her. He studied her face, her posture, the way she stood there, so still, so composed. But his eyes, the eyes that had seen centuries of power and pain, saw something else in her. Something that made him lean forward just a little bit more. "I see you now," Chairman Park said softly, almost to himself. His voice was filled with both a strange amusement and something darker, something dangerous. The girl who should have died in the massacre. The one they missed. Nia's breath hitched, but she didn't move, didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not now. "What do you want from me, little one?" the chairman continued, his voice growing colder. "You say you want your family's honor. But what does that even mean? To reclaim what was never yours to begin with? Your family was a threat to mine. They betrayed us, and I had to erase them." Nia's chest tightened. The pain she had buried deep in her heart, the grief she had pushed away for so long, bubbled up to the surface. She could feel the weight of his words like a physical blow. Her grandfather, her uncles, they hadn't been traitors. They had been men of honor, men who had stood against the corruption that ran through the veins of the Park family. They had paid the price for their defiance. But now, hearing the chairman speak, the truth of it stung like acid. "They weren't traitors," Nia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were men who stood for what was right. Your father's people murdered them." The chairman's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the room dropped, the weight of his gaze growing heavier, as though it might crush her. "You dare speak of my father like that?" Chairman Park's voice was a low growl, his anger barely contained. "You don't know what you're speaking of. You don't understand the burden he carried. He was a man of honor, a man who did what needed to be done to protect his family, his empire." The words hit Nia like a slap. Her grandfather had been the threat. Her family, the one that had been erased, had been the ones who had stood against the Park family's rise to power. She had spent her life wondering why her grandmother never spoke of those days, why she had kept their family's history so carefully hidden. Now she knew. It was because the Park family's empire was built on the graves of her ancestors. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the fire of anger threatening to consume her. But she couldn't show it. Not here. Not now. Not with the chairman's cold eyes watching her like a hawk waiting for its prey to slip up. "You say you came for revenge," the chairman continued, his voice growing sharper, more dangerous. "But what does that mean, little one? Are you going to bring your wrath to me? Are you going to kill me in my own house? You, and what army?" Nia's heart raced. The anger inside her surged, but she forced it down, letting her grandmother's lessons, the lessons of patience, of power and silence, guide her. This wasn't the moment for rage. She had a plan. She had to stay calm. But inside, the storm was building. "I'm not here to kill you," she said, her voice steady, though her insides felt like they were about to explode. "I'm here to make you understand what you've done, what your family has done. I'm here to make you remember the cost of the blood you've spilled." The chairman laughed, a low, cruel sound that echoed through the room like thunder. "You think you can make me feel anything?" he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You think your words can undo what's been done?" Nia didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was in her eyes, in the steady way she held his gaze. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the heir to a bloodline that had been destroyed, a bloodline that had been forgotten, but not by her. She remembered, and she would make the chairman remember too. Juno, standing off to the side, finally spoke. His voice was tight, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something that Nia couldn't quite place. "Father, we're not here for this," Juno said, his voice betraying his frustration. We're here to discuss business. We don't need to. The chairman's cold gaze flicked to him, and Juno fell silent. The room froze. No one spoke. The tension was unbearable. Finally, Chairman Park turned his attention back to Nia. His eyes were filled with a mixture of curiosity and something darker, something that made Nia's skin crawl. "You are not just a ghost," he said slowly, as if the thought was just dawning on him. "You are a reminder of everything we've lost, a reminder of the blood debt that we still owe. And I will not let that go unanswered." Nia's pulse quickened. She had expected many things, threats, anger, maybe even a death sentence. But this was different. This was something more dangerous. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the chairman smiled. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a smile of cold calculation. "You will be my eyes," he said. "You will see everything.
You will speak for me.
And you will watch as your revenge comes to fruition. Because, little one, there is one thing you don't understand about this world. You can't take revenge without making the enemy your equal. And in this game, if you want to win, you must be willing to play by the rules of the old world." Nia's heart raced, her mind spinning. She had been played. And now, she was trapped in a game far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The chairman turned to Juno, his voice icy. "You will give her what she needs. She will serve me, and you will respect her. Because her success will be your success. But her failure," his eyes narrowed, "her failure will be yours as well." Juno said nothing. He merely nodded, his face a mask of cold fury. Nia swallowed hard, her throat dry. The chairman's eyes had never left her, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical presence, suffocating her, binding her to his will. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. And she would have to fight for it. The silence in the hallway felt like a fog. Every step Nia took toward Juno felt like walking through thick glass, each footstep slow, deliberate, like a decision that had already been made but had not yet been acted upon. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she followed him. The envelope he carried was heavy in his hand, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy, something darker, more complicated than she had ever seen before. It had been days since that night in the restaurant. Days since the chairman had laid out his game, making Nia both a player and a pawn in a battle she had never intended to fight. She had come for revenge, for the blood that had been stolen from her family, but somewhere along the way, the rules of this game had changed. And now, she was standing at the edge of something much bigger than herself. Juno led her to a private office at the far end of the building, a room that felt colder than the rest, the walls lined with old books, the windows covered with thick curtains. He stood in front of the desk, the envelope in his hands, staring at it as if it were the only thing left in the world that mattered. Nia stood in the doorway, her eyes watching him, studying him as he opened the envelope. Her gut twisted with uncertainty. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival, and she had no idea how far she was willing to go. Juno's eyes scanned the contents of the letter quickly, his jaw tightening with each word. Whatever it was enough to shatter the controlled, cold exterior he had been maintaining. "What is it?" Nia asked again, this time more urgently. Her voice broke the silence, but it did nothing to soothe the tension in the air. Juno didn't look at her at first, his gaze fixed on the letter. But after a long pause, he turned to face her. His eyes were empty, haunted. "You were right," he said quietly. "It's all true. The story my father told, it wasn't the whole story." Nia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't speak, not because she didn't have words, but because she could feel the gravity of the moment. Every breath she took seemed to add weight to the already crushing silence between them. "They never told us everything," Juno continued, his voice steady but strained. "Sang-woo's father was the one who ordered the massacre. My father never wanted that. He never wanted it to go that far. He only wanted to remove a threat, but Sang-woo's father, Juno faltered, shaking his head as though he couldn't comprehend what he was reading. He took it too far. He wiped them out, every man, woman, child. He wanted complete annihilation. The words hit Nia like a physical blow. For years, she had wondered why her grandmother never spoke of her family's past. Now she knew. The truth had been buried, not just by her family, but by the very men who claimed to have power over the world. But why? Nia whispered. Why would Sang-woo's father do that? Juno didn't answer right away. He looked down at the letter again, as though the truth in those pages was a wound too deep to face. Because they were a threat to my father's rise. They were the only ones who could stand against him, and Sang-woo's father. He paused, his eyes darkening with a mix of fury and regret. He saw an opportunity to gain more power. He betrayed my father, used him to get rid of the Lee family. Nia's heart pounded in her chest. The ghosts of her family, the ones she had carried with her all these years, were real. They weren't just victims of a brutal massacre. They were the last bastion of resistance against the rise of the Park family. And now, after all this time, the truth had come out. But it was too late for answers. Your father, Nia said softly, taking a step forward. He didn't know? He didn't order it. Juno shook his head, his face twisted with emotion.
No.
He didn't. He never wanted it to go that far. But once it was done, he couldn't undo it. He couldn't stop what was already set in motion. Sang-woo's father poisoned everything. My father has spent his whole life trying to bury that truth, trying to live with the shame of what was done. For a long time, the two of them stood in silence, each one lost in the weight of their own thoughts. The world around them felt hollow, like everything they had built, everything they had known, was crumbling to dust. But Nia knew one thing. The truth, as painful and as terrifying as it was, had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The blood debt she had come to collect had been paid, but not in the way she had imagined. She looked at Juno, her heart heavy with understanding. So, what now? She asked quietly, her voice breaking through the silence. Juno's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw something in him that she hadn't seen before. It was not the cold, calculated leader of the Mafia, the dragon who had ruled over them all. No, this was something more human, something raw. Now, he said slowly, his voice low and filled with resolve, now we end it. All of it. The past, the lies, the bloodshed. It ends tonight. Nia nodded. There was no turning back now. She had come for revenge, yes, but she had also come for something greater. Something that could change the course of everything. They didn't speak again as they walked out of the room, the weight of their shared silence heavier than anything else in that moment. Nia knew where this was headed, but she wasn't afraid. She was prepared. She had faced her family's ghosts, and now it was time to put them to rest once and for all. The cold night air bit at her skin as they made their way through the streets, their steps in sync, their fates tied together in a way neither of them could deny. They reached the penthouse, the place that had once been a symbol of power and dominance, but tonight it felt like the end of a long road, a road paved with secrets, betrayal, and blood. Inside, the chairman sat alone in his chair, waiting. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharp, his face unreadable. But Nia knew the truth now. She knew what had been hidden, and she knew what had to be done. Juno stepped forward, his voice steady, but there was a hardness to it now. Father, we need to talk. The chairman's gaze flicked to Nia, and for the briefest of moments, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or maybe even regret. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. You've come to say goodbye, then? The chairman asked, his voice laced with a dark amusement. Juno didn't answer. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun, his fingers tight around the cold metal. Nia stepped back, her heart racing, her breath quickening. This was it.
The end.
The chairman's eyes widened, but he didn't move. He was a man who had seen death 1,000 times, who had commanded it with a single word. And yet, in this moment, he was powerless. I'm not here to kill you, Juno said quietly. I'm here to end the cycle.
To stop the bloodshed.
To stop being your puppet. And with that, he raised the gun. The sound of the shot was deafening, echoing through the room like a final judgment. The chairman collapsed, the empire that had ruled for decades falling with him. Nia stood frozen in place, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had done. But for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The blood debt had been paid. Juno looked at her, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's over," he whispered. Nia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "It's over." And as they walked away from the penthouse, away from the empire that had once threatened to swallow them both whole, Nia felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. She had faced her family's ghosts, had confronted the brutal truth, and now she was free. Merry Christmas, everyone. Thank you for following this journey with us. Don't forget to subscribe to support our growth.